1 Samuel chapters 8 and 9 tonight. First question on your handout is the question, what sort of stubbornness do you find particularly maddening in other people? Notice I put the question at the end of other people, because none of us have any particularly stubborn habits, right, that are maddening to other people.
I think Wendy might have said.
I'm not going there, brother. I was thinking about, and I just kind of mentioned this, I know I put other people, but one of the things that, if you're looking, that bothers me personally in other people, if you're looking for somebody to be sympathetic about traditional things, you're coming to the wrong person if you come to me. I'm not very, very good in dealing with things like that, and just the idea, sometimes people hold fast to tradition, not even religious traditions, I'm just talking about it in general. And there comes up with a better way and a better reason for doing something different, but people say, well, we can't do it that way because we've always, done it this way, so we've got to stick with it. That's kind of frustrating to me. What about any other traits?
Do the same thing over and over, expect a different result.
Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty good one there. Do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So that would be stubbornness defined there, wouldn't it? Kind of aggravating. Procrastination, that's a good one. I didn't think about that. Anybody in here a procrastinator? One brave soul. Two brave souls, yeah. Not for me. Procrastination's not for me.
I won't name any names, but it is really bothersome to me when the alarm goes off 6 times and someone will not get up.
That's not procrastination. That's lazy.
You tell her.
Yeah, I never did understand the purpose of that. I mean,
You said it 20 minutes earlier.
yeah, you get up an hour later. I don't understand. I'd sleep for the hour and just take the wake up an hour later. Yeah, I don't understand that either.
That's options.
What about fact? I've got on here fact denial. You ever go in front of somebody and you bring the facts and you lay them out where it's crystal clear and they can see it, but they just say, no, I'm not going to accept that. Anybody ever deal with people like that?
That's a close candid tradition.
Yeah, it probably is. It probably is in some ways. There's some stubborn traits probably that all of us have that could be aggravating to other people. And of course, if you read ahead in our lesson tonight, was Israel a stubborn nation? Yeah, they were, weren't they? Did that ever provoke God? Did it ever provoke any response from Him, any emotion from Him? Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to read about some of that stubbornness in play tonight. Okay, so obviously we got 2 chapters here. May mention a couple weeks running here. We're not going to have time to read much of it, if any. And so I'm going to trust that you have read it, or at least you're going to read it along the way as we go here. So question number 2, who did Samuel intend to succeed him whenever he died? Yeah, his sons. And how many sons did he have? At least that he intended to succeed him. 2 sons, right? What were they like?
I was going to say, it's sort of.
Yeah, they were a lot like Eli's sons. In fact, I think it says there in, let me get here in chapter 8, not in chapter 9, might make it a little bit better. In verse 3, it says, his sons did not walk in his ways. Usually when the Bible makes a statement like that, what's it talking about? Usually it's for the worst, isn't it? Sometimes it's for the better, but usually the majority of the time that you'll read about that statement in the Bible, it's for the worst. But basically the Bible is indicating to us these men, or these 2 young guys, were not like Samuel at all. So what were some of the ways that they differed from Samuel?
They were dishonest and were not impartial judges.
Yeah, and why was that the case? What was their motivation?
Money.
Greed. Yeah, they were greedy for gain, weren't they? They wanted gain, whether it was money or property or possessions, and they were willing to do anything in order to get it. And so specifically mentioned there is they would accept bribes. You know, if somebody came to them with a case, and that was part of what judges did in that particular time, then you slid some money under the table, then they would rule in your favor. You know, they didn't have a problem ruling in favor of the guilty, did they? As long as it benefited them, as long as it profited them. You kind of think about, or I was thinking about this idea. Whenever we read about, especially in biblical times, the successors of leaders, who generally were those successors? They were usually blood, weren't they? They were usually somewhere in the bloodline of that family. And so you see it through the kings. You even see it from time to time in the judges. Remember when Gideon overcame the Midianites, that the people wanted his sons to rule in his stead. You know, to set Gideon up as a leader, and then his descendants would rule over them. And it kind of got me to thinking here, you know, what is it that makes a good leader?
Character.
It's character, isn't it? It's not your bloodline. You know, how many times in the Bible do you read about, you know, somebody being a good person and then the next generation is a bad generation, or somebody being a bad generation and then the next person is a good generation? You know, the idea of a bloodline being a reliable basis on which to establish leadership, I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? Because it's going to vary from person to person. And so generally what you see, even when you look in not just biblical history, but in world history, you look at a bloodline of leaders. There were some good leaders in that bloodline. There were some bad leaders, right? And that's just kind of the way that it goes, because bloodline isn't really a good way to qualify people as leaders. But generally, that's how it was done back then. You know, I was kind of thinking about it today, just application in the Lord's church today. You know, what if we based the qualifications of elders being that your forefathers had to be an elder in the church? Would that be a good basis on which to establish somebody into the eldership? Well, it's not a reliable one, is it? You know, it may be that they may be a good person and they may be qualified, but it could also be the case that they're not, because the bloodline has nothing to do with qualifications for a good leader. And I think that's a good reflection, again, when we think about the eldership. So, these two sons were going to follow. They were going to be the next leaders of Israel. At least that was Samuel's intentions, but they were not like him at all. So the elders of Israel come to Samuel with a request, and what request did they have? Now remember, Samuel is getting older here, and that's kind of, I think, indicated by the fact that he set up his two sons to basically rule part of Israel at this particular time. That he's growing older in age, and as he's growing older, then the elders of Israel come to him with a request. And what is that request?
They want a king.
Yeah, and why did they want to be a king, or want a king?
Part of their request is rational.
Okay?
Because I've always looked at it in a negative light, but their other option is dishonest dudes.
Yeah, and keep this in mind too. You know, we're probably 20 years removed from Eli, but still, it hadn't been so far long ago that did these people know what it's like to have wicked people in power? Remember Eli's sons? Remember the things that they did to them, and how basically they'd come to even hate going to the tabernacle, even hate offering sacrifices to God. And so I think Adam brings up a good point there. You know, they did have a legitimate complaint, didn't they? And they did not want these two sons of Samuel being their rulers after Samuel was gone. However, part of their request wasn't legitimate, right? And what was that? They wanted to establish a leadership that God told them not to establish, right? So a legitimate complaint, absolutely, but the conclusion that they come to, that we want to establish a king and a royal line here, was not legitimate in God's sight. And where'd they come up with an idea like that? Yeah, that's how all the other nations around them ran their government, right? They had kings. And so they were looking at them and they were saying, hey, we want to be like all these guys. You know, we want to have a leadership, a government like that. We want a king to rule over us. And so they were focused upon not the way that God wanted things, but the way the world thought things should work. You know, that's another good principle and lesson for us when it comes to the church. You know, God has set up the church in an orderly fashion. He's appointed people within it, and He's given them specific jobs that they're to do. And sometimes men look at that and they say, "Well, I think this might work better." You know, for instance, are there any? And I'm not just talking about in the religious world. I'm talking about within the Lord's church. Are there any people or congregations that you know of that might be opposed to an eldership that don't have one currently? I know of several. I won't mention them by name, but I know of several. In fact, I had one person say to me one time, he said, things are going so good right now. He said, I don't know if I'd want to appoint elders. I thought, man, that's a pretty brave statement to make, isn't it? But it's this idea, you know, well, I think this would work better. And some people look at it and say, well, I think the majority of the men voting on something would work better than an eldership. I like that system better. Well, what's the problem with that? Where'd that idea come from? It came from the world. It's the way of men. It's the way of the world. It's not the way that God designed and intended for the church. So we can get into difficult situations when we see something within the world and we try to take that and incorporate it into a system that God designed and developed and put into action for us. And that's exactly what Israel did here. Did that request ever get them into trouble? Yeah, got them into plenty of trouble, didn't it? We'll read about a lot of those things as we go along. So that was the request that they had, and how did Samuel react to that? How do you feel about that request? Yeah, it didn't make him happy in any way. In fact, he was angered. He was displeased with this request that they came to him with. Now, whenever he did say this, though, he said, "I'll pray to God and I'll give you, whatever God's reply is." And whenever he went to God with this request, God he tried to help Samuel, put this into perspective. And what question is, that's question number 4 here. How does God do that? How does God help or try to help Samuel to put this request of Israel in perspective? How did Samuel feel?
He took it personally.
He took it personally, did he? And think about that. Why would Samuel take it personally? Well, yeah. First thing that comes to mind is those were his boys, right? And now they're saying, we don't want these guys. They're no good scoundrels. I mean, I understand that they weren't very good people, but they were still his sons and they were still his family, right? And so that would have been difficult to accept. I think another reason, it's not really stated, but we kind of talked about the idea, Samuel is getting up there in years. And generally speaking, when you get older, does your ability increase or decrease?
Well, it depends on if you're on the Supreme Court, a politician, or something.
Okay. How about you, Danny? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but I think we all understand as we grow older, our mental abilities aren't as sharp as they once were. Our physical abilities are not what they used to be. And Samuel could have taken it personally here, where maybe he's thinking, well, these guys are thinking I'm too old to do anything anymore. I don't have any good input for them to help him out. And so he did take it personally, but God tried to help him put it into perspective. And how did he do that? Yeah, he said, listen, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. This wasn't Samuel's plan that he'd come up with, right? This was God's plan. And so basically, I think what God is telling him here is, don't take it so personal. It's nothing against you. If anything, it's something against me. And so he talks about Israel's history, just a little bit there in verse 8. What was kind of God's general overview of Israel's history when it came to dealing with him? Yeah, they had a long history, didn't they, of turning their back on God, of rejecting what he told them to do, of disobeying his commandments. And so basically tells Samuel, don't take it personally. It's not an attack on you. Rather, it's an attack on me. It's just the way that they've been since the time that I brought them up out of Egypt. So God tells Samuel to go ahead and grant the people what they want, right? To listen to their requests. Now, I want us to stop and think about it a little bit. Why did God tell Samuel to do that? Because this was obviously against God's wishes, right? It was against his commandments, wasn't it? He told them when he brought them up out of Egypt, they weren't to establish a king over them. So why would God go ahead and tell Samuel to grant their request?
They weren't doing it the way he told them to in the first place. So.
Okay.
And they clearly weren't learning from that mistake, so they might as well learn from another mistake.
Okay. So Wes points out two good things. The first one is, if you look at their history during the times of the judges, are they following God? Well, they're just up and down, up and down, up and down, aren't they? So they're not really following God to start with. The second thing is, you ever had your children want something and you say no, then they come to you again, they ask you and you say no, and they just keep on asking and keep on asking. And finally you say, all right, you can have it, but I know what's going to happen. Anybody ever do that to their children? Yeah. It's a hard way to learn a lesson, right? But sometimes if people are persistent, the only way they can learn that lesson is how? Yeah, experience, right? By actually living through it and going through it. And so God says, okay, you guys aren't going to listen to me. You're not going to do what I say. You're set that this is the pathway that you're going to pursue. Go ahead and pursue. And so we'll read about some of the things that happened to them along the way. But these people, God commands them to listen, grant their request, but what was he also supposed to do? Samuel, that is.
Tell them what's going to happen.
Yeah, he's supposed to warn them, right? You guys want a king? Let me tell you what it means to have a king over you. And basically, a lot of times, we're like that as humans. I mean, sometimes we get dead set in our minds, this is the way that we're going to do something. You know, this is the path that we're going to pursue. Somebody can come along and they say, whoa, wait a minute. You know, I can give you some good reasons why you shouldn't. But sometimes you're just so dead set that this is the way it's going to be. All you can see are the pros, or maybe you think, well, all the pros outweigh the cons. And I think that's kind of what the boat that Israel was in here. You know, did Samuel tell them what was going to happen? Yeah. I mean, he laid it out in black and white and warned them very, very plainly. But they were dead set this is how it was going to be. So didn't really change anything along the way. So question number 6 here, what were some of Samuel's predictions about what it would be like living under a king? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I was going through and actually ended up highlighting some of these in my Bible. I don't know if you do that in yours or not. But in verses 10 through 17, I noticed 6 times there's a phrase, he will take. You notice that? It's in verse 11, again in verse 13, again in verse 14, in verse 15, 16, and 17. So 6 different times he tells them this is what it's going to be like living under a king. He's going to take. There's nothing about what he's going to give. You know, it's all about taking. And if you look at those 6 times there, what are the 6 things there that he said he would take? Again, verse 11, then verses 13 through 17, each has one. What are some of the things there?
Sons.
Yeah, so in verse 11 he says he's going to take your sons and he's going to make them his soldiers. He's going to make them his horsemen. He's going to enlist them in his army. What's the second thing he's going to take?
Daughters.
Your daughters, right? They're going to be the ones who cook. They're going to be the ones who mix the perfumes for him. They're going to be the ones who take care of the clothing and the things like that. So he's going to take away your daughters. What's the next thing? Yeah, so he's going He's going to take the best of your fields, the best of your vineyards, the best of your orchards. What's the fourth thing?
Taxes.
Yeah, an extra tithe, an extra 10% on top, and that's going to be for the high-ranking officials. He's got to pay all of his people alongside of him, all those guys who are helping out so much. So he's going to take that away from you, and that's what he's going to pay those high-ranking officials with. What's the fifth thing? Yeah, he's going to take your servants. You're not going to have servants anymore. He's going to have servants. And he's going to take yours away from you and use them for his own. And then the sixth thing that's mentioned there?
Livestock.
Yeah, he's going to take 1/10 of your livestock, right? So basically, he tells them all those different things. Now, you stop and think about Israel. And think about, they weren't, well, at this particular time, they were probably hurting because they were under the oppression of the Philistines. But they weren't, like scraping the bottom of the barrel. They were doing pretty good. But if somebody told you, hey, we got this new system of government that we want to install. And if we install it, here's what's going to happen. Your sons are going to have to go be soldiers. Your daughters are going to have to go make perfumes and, clothing and things like that for the government. We're going to take away the best field that you have, or your best orchard or your best vineyard. We probably don't have those things, but fields, we have a lot of those. You're going to have to take 1/10 of your income, and you're going to have to use it to pay some of these high-ranking officials within the government itself. You're going to have to, anybody got any servants here? I don't think we have to worry about that one. But I'm going to take 1/10 of your livestock too. How many people would vote in favor of that? Would anybody here, you guys be in favor of a government like that?
We do all the time.
I was going to say, we get way more than 10% right now.
Okay, this is a hypothetical, guys. You're not following me here. New system, new government. This is the way it's going to be. Before, you had all those things, okay? How many people in their right mind would say, that sounds pretty good to me? I mean, if you were really stopping and listening and considering to what Samuel was saying, you would say, man, there is no way that's a good deal, right? But again, the people were just dead set. This was the way that it was going to be. So question number 7, how were they affected by Samuel's warning? They were not. They refused to listen. In fact, they told Samuel after he said all these things, they said, no, well, we're going to have a king. So they insisted on Samuel appointing them a king. And question number 8 here, what were the primary reasons that the king appealed to the people of Israel? We mentioned they wanted to be like everybody around them. That was one of the reasons. But what do they say there in verse 20 of chapter 8? Yeah, they wanted somebody to judge them, right? They wanted somebody to tell them, this is right, this is wrong, we're going to do this, we're not going to do this. They wanted somebody to fight for them, right? They didn't want to, you read about all these battles that they had, a lot of them, they just enlisted men. You were just drafted and said, let's go, we're going to go fight. So this guy's going to be organizing our armies, he's going to be the one fighting for us. And then I think the third one was, they wanted somebody that they could actually see and touch. And I don't know why that's the case, but we're physical people. We want something and someone that we can see, that we can touch, maybe even that we can hold accountable if things go wrong, right? They didn't really have that luxury with God. And so there were several reasons that were mentioned there as to why they wanted a king. Now, when you get into chapter 9, we read about the first choice of God for Israel's king. And of course, I think everybody here knows, I don't think it's going to be a spoiler, but that's Saul, right? Saul's the first king of Israel. And so question number 9, he had some unique physical characteristics, right? What were some of those unique physical traits that he possessed? Okay, he was tall. And was he like an inch taller than everybody else?
His shoulders.
Yeah, the Bible says that his head and shoulders were up above everybody else. So do you think Israel liked that? You think they would have said, man, that's a good looking king right there. Well, you think about physical appearance, is that important to the world and a leader? It certainly is. And if you're going to go fight some enemies and your king is head and shoulders above everybody else, that would naturally give you some confidence and probably instill a little bit of fear into your enemies. What other physical trait does it mention there? Yeah, he's a good-looking guy, right? He was easy on the eyes. Is that important to a lot of people in a leader today? Well, you don't want Frankenstein to be your leader, do you? I mean, you want somebody when you look at him, you say, "Boy, he looks good," or "She's a good-looking lady." And so that was Saul. And what kind of family did he come from? I know what he says a little later on, but what does it say about him there in verse 9 or chapter 9, verse 1 there?
Benjaminite, and he was a strong guy, mighty man of power.
Yeah, so he came from a family that was well-to-do, and I've made mention of that phrase there, mighty man of power. It's used several different ways in the Bible. Sometimes it refers to wealth, means a person has a lot of money. Sometimes it refers to fighting ability. Sometimes it refers to just being famous, being so having prestige around your name. But there was a little bit of a little bit of appeal to the background of Saul, to his family too. So you think about what Israel wanted in a king. I mean, when they looked at this guy, they probably thought, well, he fits the bill perfectly. Just the right guy for the job. We read about Saul taking a trip. He ends up taking that trip because he's looking for some lost donkeys. That's also kind of interesting. This is probably not one or two. It's probably a herd of donkeys. And what do we know about donkeys? Who generally rode on donkeys? Royalty, right? So these weren't just some like scrub animals in that day and age. They were highly prestigious animals. And so Saul's out here. His father's donkeys are lost. He's out here trying to find this herd of donkeys. They look for some time unsuccessfully, and Saul finally tells his servant, he said, "We got to get back home. If we don't get back home, they're going to think we're lost, and they're going to be sending people out to find us. So we got to get back home. Probably not going to find them." And his servant comes up with an idea. He says, "Well, before we go back home, there's a guy that can see everything. Whatever he tells everybody, it comes true. And so let's go talk to him before we go home. Let's see if he can give us any information about these donkeys." Saul's reservation was, well, we don't have anything to give him. And the Bible tells us that generally in that day and age, it was a custom if you went to see a seer, you brought a gift for his services. And Saul's servant says, "Well, I've got a little bit here. I think, how much of a shekel of silver was it? I don't remember exactly, but it was part of a shekel of silver." And Saul said, "Well, that's good enough for me." And so he decided to do that. Now, remember, they differed in what they were supposed to do. Question number 11. When there was a difference between what his servant thought they should do and what Saul thought they should do, whose opinion prevailed?
Well, it was the servant's idea.
Yeah. And what does that tell you about Saul?
He was young.
Yeah, it indicates that, he doesn't have this big head. He's not this power guru that says, "No, whatever I say is what goes." This is his servant. And he says, "That's a good idea. I think we should go and do that." And the first people that they meet when they're going to find the seer, going to find Samuel, is who? Who gives him the directions to help find this man? Yeah, some young women, we might say girls. And I don't know, I was kind of thinking about this idea. I don't know what your experience has been. I'm a man, obviously. But have you ever got directions or asked directions from a woman? And they give you these directions and you try to follow their directions and you just don't even come close. Now, that's not a knock on women, because women can give the same directions to another woman and they can go straight to where they tell them to go. I think there's just kind of a disconnect, generally speaking, between the way that men want directions and the way that women want directions. Men want road names, they want directions, they want right, left, up, down, but that's not always the way that women give directions. But it is interesting that he was humble enough to ask these girls to how to find this guy, and then to accept their directions and to follow them. And of course, when he gets there, God had already told Samuel that he's sending Saul, that he was going to be the next leader over Israel. And so Samuel invites him to spend the night with him. He tells him that his donkeys that were lost 3 days ago were found. And then he tells him that Israel's desire is for him to be their king. And question number 15 here, what objection does Saul raise when he first hears Samuel's prediction here?
He's kind of concerned about if he was from the smallest tribe.
Yeah, he was from the smallest tribe, and he said he was from the least of all families. Well, we just read that his father was a man of great renown, right? Great power. So Saul was just being humble. He was just showing his lowly spirit. And it's always interesting to me when we first look at Saul. A lot of times when we think of him, we think about it as that crazy power-driven guy at the end of his life. But I think in the beginning, he was a really lowly, humble individual, don't you? I think some of the things that we read about, and even as we read about in the next couple of chapters about him trying to get appointed as king, I think some of those traits will shine through. But it is interesting that he was not the man, in his younger years, he's not the man that he ended up being in his old age. So, all right, anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions before we end tonight?
That's not too far off today either. There's a lot of people going into these positions of power and authority are not bad motive, bad people. I think that power and money corrupts.
Yeah.
Absolute power corrupts absolute. Right?
Yeah, and I mean it's not just in it's not just in government. I mean I think about it in athletes, sports. You see some people when they first come into professional sports, they're very humble individuals. Give them 20 years and they're really good, and they don't quite have the same attitude that they came in with. So it's just kind of human nature, isn't it?